multi-platform program for everybody who needs healthcare. I don't know what we are anymore. I'm having an identity crisis now that we've moved to Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and everything else. But it's good to be here live on video. So we are, this is our post-election podcast, Stephanie. Tell me, have you survived fully, spiritually, mentally, this elections process? And how did it hit you, especially as it relates to like Medicare for All worlds?
Oh man. So the election process, the election experience sort of always coincides with my birthday experience because my birthday is November 4th. So,
ruins your birthday experience.
Yeah. It doesn't usually subsume it this much, but there is usually like a political element of my birthday, meaning everybody's drinking margaritas and their eyes glued to the TV.
Nice.
But I really felt more relief than I didn't realize, what I was going to feel when I found out that Biden won. And it was actually just a relief, a huge relief. And I didn't think I'd be so happy to hear that Joe Biden won. And, we often say in organizing land that we're not, choosing a savior, we're choosing an opponent, actually. And I'm really happy to be going up against Joe Biden now instead of what we've been doing the last 4 years, which is going up against Trump and all the Democrats who have been hiding behind Trump.
That's for sure.
How about you?
I felt kind of similar. I think relief captured my emotional experience more than like happiness or excitement. And I think, it wasn't nearly as wrenching as 2016 was. We were just totally caught by surprise, and there was shock. And, we had as you remember, we had a conference like right after the elections, and we had record numbers of people turn out. People were just freaked out, worried about losing kind of basic human rights that we had started to take for granted in the United States. We did lose some of those over the last 4 years. I'm confident we can get a lot of them back quickly. But also people were just like not sure what to do, but they were ready to fight. And so it was actually nice after the elections to see that fight back moment. And we'll have to see what happens now after this election. This is much muckier, but it was similar in that the expectations were completely different. Like the expectations set by the press were that there was, going to be a Democratic wipeout. It was like Biden had a 90+% chance of winning. According to 538, Democrats had a 70% chance of taking the Senate. Biden ended up squeaking by. It looks like Democrats probably are not going to take the Senate, although there's a chance this is going to be your home state of Georgia is going to be like the home of a total elections clusterfuck. Can you imagine like being the only 2 seats in the country where the Senate is decided and there's no other elections happening? There's going to be so much money and ads pouring into your home state. Warn your mom and dad, Half
of the relief, I think, for the rest of the country is like, it's over. And then Georgia, it's like, it's just about to rip up. Like everybody is about to focus on Georgia. That victory in Georgia has been years coming. I actually myself canvassed for Obama in 2012, not even so much for the candidate himself, but to build sort of the infrastructure that we need to flip Georgia blue, which we knew could happen. So it's been a while, and it's so great to see it happening now.
For sure. And I was born in Pennsylvania. I didn't spend much time there, but I would like to take this moment to adopt Pennsylvania formally as my home state. I disavowed them for the last 4 years after the way they flipped in 2016. But Georgia and Pennsylvania really came through at the presidential level for sure.
Yeah, so looking back at, the Trump era, thank God we can like put a cap on it and say, this was it.
The retrospective I've been waiting for.
Exactly. Just, like we were talking about, thinking back to 2016 and the shock that we all felt. Even Trump himself looked shocked the next day, like, oh shit, what did I just do? And everything that sort of happened, after that, we sort of think of this as like a dark period. I mean, just in terms of our movement, we weren't obviously able to push for Medicare for all. It wasn't going to happen. any time during the last 4 years. But what really did happen to our movement these last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to think that sort of and I've been at this for a long time. I think I've been a full-time staff person in the Medicare for All movement for almost 15 years now. And we had our biggest surge of growth as a movement during the Trump era, which is strange because you would think it's kind of the moment of least hope for being able to pass the legislation and get it over the finish line. But 2017 was really just this watermark year. Obviously, 2016 was when Bernie had that sort of a credible run at the presidency, and I think that made somewhat of a difference. But then Republican attempts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, I felt like that really put healthcare in the hot seat, and people had to come out in large numbers to fight just as a survival mechanism, right? Because they were really looking at having this like already limited safety net and rug pulled out from them. And when people turned out, to my surprise, actually, I thought there would be a lot of like, let's keep the healthcare system we have. But to my surprise, people turned out and were like, obviously you cannot undermine the system we have because it's already so limited, but we need something more. We need Medicare for all. And just to remind people, including ourselves here, when we ended 2016, this was, the height of the Bernie campaign, there were only 63 legislative co-sponsors in the House and in the Senate supporting Medicare for all legislation. Only 63. And just, less than a year later, we were up to 142. So more than doubling the legislative co-sponsorship and leadership in the House and in the Senate in 1 year. So although we could think of the horrible things that happened under the Trump administration, I'm kind of inspired by the grassroots stuff that happened during that period and how we've grown as a movement.
Yeah, we really did think we were going to enter a dark period. I think right at the beginning there, we thought, how the hell are we going to organize in this situation? But I think another positive effect, I guess, if you can call it that, of Trump winning was that all of a sudden the Democratic Party was without a leader. It had been assumed to be Hillary Clinton, and she had a very concrete ideology about healthcare, and that was absolutely not single payer.
I think it's in our intro, actually. Never, ever, ever.
No words.
Right.
And I think when she lost and the Democratic Party was sort of scrambling to find a new identity, and there wasn't all of a sudden a very strict top-down order about what we were not and we're not going to stand for, there were more and more co-sponsors coming out of that because they could do so without fear of retribution from the top of the Democratic Party, I think. And it's been a little bit unfortunate to see that with that sort of opening for a new path for the Democratic Party, we've somehow ended up reverting back to centrism, maybe even worse than we had before. I don't know if you could say Joe Biden's a worse candidate than Hillary Clinton, but I mean, we did have that window of opportunity. I did think we grew there as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, if everyone can probably remember those moments after the 2016 election, there was a lot of like soul searching over the heart of the soul of the Democratic Party. And it was like, maybe what the Democratic Party has been doing for the last 10 or 15 years hasn't been working, right? They had been losing not just the presidency after Obama, but they had been losing especially state legislative districts and governorships at just record numbers.
Continuing into 2020.
Right, and that led to a lot of the gerrymandering of districts that was also making it hard to win at the congressional level. But that we did, during that period, there was also some positive steps in Congress. I remember there was a whole wave of progressive candidates that came in 2018, including, AOC. There was especially, I think, like a wave of female progressive leadership that was really awesome, and it was running on Medicare for All, and it was kind of our new like flag bearers on Medicare for All in the House and in the Senate. Yeah,
and I think it's been really great to see the establishment start to respond to us for once. I mean, before Bernie Sanders ran, there was a media blackout on Medicare for All. There was a media blackout on Bernie Sanders for a while before he really picked up steam. And when the media blackout ended, it ended with quite a lot of attacks rather than fair coverage of Medicare for all, but the establishment did actually have to start reckoning with us and engaging with us because we were becoming more powerful. And we look at the bills that have come out of this era, the Medicare for America and Medicare for All Who Want It, Pete Buttigieg's plan, as as policies that we're obviously going to have to fight, and co-option attempts by the Democratic Party. Of course they are, but they're also responses to a growing movement. Right. They wouldn't have done this before because they didn't take us seriously, and now they have to.
Yeah, and it was not that long ago during the Democratic primaries where Medicare for All was really clearly the number one issue in every single Democratic debate. And like you said, all these bills that were launched and proposals that were launched that kind of sound like Medicare for All, I don't know, the analogy I like to think of is like they basically had to come up with a bunch of cover bands of Medicare for All, but none of them will ever be as sexy as the original.
No.
So don't be fooled.
No off-brand Fruit Loops.
Exactly. Oh yeah, that's dangerous for your kids. So moving on from our like retrospective, where I think these last 4 years, although they were really dark at the top level and in terms of the things that Trump did, at the grassroots level, we really made some massive strides, and I think we've started to change the calculus and the political terrain around Medicare for All, both in the Democratic Party, but also more broadly in Congress. But let's shift now to what has happened immediately after this election ended. There was immediately some fighting and scrambling over how the Democrats kind of underperformed in this election. So, as of our recording this, the results are not all in yet, not for all the Senate seats and not for all the House seats either. But we know that Democrats are probably going to lose quite a few seats in the House. They're going to hang on to a majority. How slim that majority is remains to be seen. And in all likelihood, Democrats will not be able to retake the Senate. I think the best case scenario for Democrats is that it ends up being 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and then 2 runoff elections in Georgia, like we were talking about. So they have kind of a chance to tie it up, and then Kamala Harris would be the tying vote in the Senate. But statistically, that's apparently not very likely to happen. So as soon as all this came out, and again, like we said at the beginning, these elections were so far off from what the polls had projected were going to happen. There was immediately like a lot of blame pie being divided up amongst Democrats, and a bunch of centrists started like throwing shade at progressives and saying that it's the people who are running on Medicare for All and Black Lives Matter.
Don't worry, Biden's going to unify us all. So.
Oh, I can't wait to be unified. I've been waiting. I wonder what it feels like to be unified.
What does it mean?
Like a squishy feeling, or is it like being crushed to death with somebody else?
Do they just get on board with Medicare for All and then we get unified?
That would work for me. I'm sure that's what he has in mind. So anyway, there was a few things that went on, but there was on November 5th, which is almost immediately after the election, there was a Democratic Caucus call. And for folks who don't know, the Democratic Caucus, usually it meets in person in a giant room in DC, and people will leak news to the press. But what you don't get is a full audio recording leaked to the press of the caucus, which is what happened after this caucus call. And we had, Representative Jim Clyburn from South Carolina and also Representative Abigail Spanberger from Virginia making these claims that, since they see all these attack ads being used against them, calling them socialists, saying that they want to defund the police, they'll always put up photos of like Bernie Sanders and AOC behind these candidates who are actually very centrist, opposite of socialism Democrats. They're like pro-corporate Democrats. So they say that it's really the progressive wing of the party that almost got Biden defeated and that is undermining them. So Stephanie, how did this go down, especially like on Twitter? And what's your take on this particular blame pie debate?
Yeah. Ugh. It's amazing that these moderates are understanding their races in terms of like the opposition's messaging of them, right, rather than the strength of their own message, which you can see they really don't have. They're just sort of being chased around by the Republicans and taking the socialism bait. And I think that AOC was really right to call them out, as she did, and has gone viral on Twitter, to point out that, every single swing seat House Democrat who endorsed Medicare for All won re-election or is on track to win re-election. And then she writes every single one. And that includes Jared Golden of Maine, Ann Kirkpatrick in Arizona, Mark Levin in California, Katie Porter in California, Susan Wild, and then Susan Wild and Matt Cartwright, both in Pennsylvania, seem on track to win as well. And I think, there's a lot to parse through here that we're going to know more when the dust settles. But yeah, I think that it's obviously wrong. It's clearly wrong to say that Medicare for All is not a political winner. In fact, it seems like a political winner. And I think that for them, for moderates, they see a swing district as meaning like a large number of moderates in that district, right. And then in order to win that district, you have to tech center. And I think that that's not true of every single swing district. I think a lot of swing districts just have maybe equal proportions of, more conservative voters and more lefty voters. And it's really actually exactly what we've always been saying all the time, that it's about turnout and grassroots organizing and all of the things that we need to do to win what we want.
Right. And I guess technically, if you were to tax center, you would run on Medicare for All because Medicare for All is supported by like almost all people who identify as Democrats, but then a very, very strong majority of people who identify as independent. And then even then, more than a third of people who identify as conservative or Republicans. So the Medicare for All is a centrist position, more or less. And to me, I think it's more of a sort of a working class populist, anti-racist position. It's not like a left-right thing. In the same way that like Medicare today is not, the existence of Medicare is not a left-right thing, right? Once you have it, it suddenly becomes, invaluable to everyone who needs it. And I think that is why it has been a winner in these swing state districts. And the seats that Democrats have lost, those, as you said, have actually mostly been the same centrists who are complaining about progressives tanking their chances of winning. So suck on that.
That's the spirit of unity.
Yes, I'm working on it.
Yeah, and maybe there's also, just the fact that if you're running on Medicare for All, you're also running on these populist policies, not just Medicare for All, but all the kinds of things that that people want to see their Congress people fighting for. And when you ask people why they vote this way or that way, it's often not even, necessarily so strictly ideologically driven, but what have they seen their congressperson doing for them and how have they been fighting for them? And that's absolutely not what we've seen with Donna Shalala. And in fact, there's a lot of analysis about that. And as well, you can see it exactly happening with Katie Porter, who won in what's a pretty actually wealthy county. Whereas
this is in California, yeah.
In California, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think Katie Porter's district didn't have a Democrat for like 45 years until she won it running on Medicare for All. So there's a lesson for someone if anyone wants to pay attention.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's also the fact that we've had a growth in strong Medicare for All leaders this time. So, Jabal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, Cori Bush, I think they did not actually replace necessarily Medicare for All co-sponsors, did they?
I think most of them did.
They did replace Medicare for All.
Mary Newman replaced a non-Medicare for All.
That's right.
But I'd say they replaced kind of more tepid supporters, long-time reps who were kind of in positions of power who were not running on Medicare for All. They weren't advocating strongly publicly for it. They weren't part of the Medicare for All caucus. But it was on their position statement. They had put their name on the bill. And I think people may not think this is a big deal, but I think it's actually a really big deal. I think if we're being honest about the co-sponsorship list, that huge surge of co-sponsors, if I think we had a vote like tomorrow on Medicare for All, and how many of those reps feel so strongly enough about Medicare for all, like feel it in their bones, and it's like really part of their moral compass that they would continue to support Medicare for all, even in the face of like massive money being spent against them in their district, ads being run, you know, hospitals in their district potentially coming after them, insurance companies coming after them. How many would like stick up to that? I think we would lose a lot. So it really, to win this, we not only need a majority of legislators who are like on the bill, we need a majority of legislators who are like on the bill and like their heart is in the movement. So seeing like these new leaders this election cycle come in who like this is really part of their core being, I think that matters a lot, and it's really going to help to have their leadership in Congress starting to bring around some of those other reps too.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we have to remember that our work is not done just because we have our representative or senator co-sponsoring the bill, that actually we need not just wide, but also really deep commitment, because it's just going to get harder and harder as we get closer and closer to winning.
Yeah. In the grassroots, we call that like resolutionary politics, when like a group passes a resolution in favor of Medicare for all, then does nothing about it to support Medicare for all. I don't know what the equivalent like catchphrase is for members of Congress, but we need to get beyond like the resolutionary politics in Congress as well. So,
yeah, especially in the safely Democratic seats. You know, sometimes just getting somebody on the bill is a huge victory. I mean, don't want to downplay that, but it's certainly not the end. So let's pivot now to what's next for our movement. So the Biden administration, this was not, I think, what we all wanted when we started out with the primary process. He was not only not a Medicare for all supporter, but explicitly has stated multiple times that if a Medicare for all bill comes across his desk, he will veto it.
Lovely.
And we're also looking, I mean, at, we don't know what's going to happen with the Senate, but even in the best case scenario, we're going to break even with it. And the House isn't going to be very strong either. Ben, what do we do now?
Yeah, so this is really a different scenario than if there had been a so-called blue wave and Democrats had kind of, you know, taken the presidency, but also strong majorities in the Senate and the House. You know, if that had happened, I think there would have been really intense pressure for them to pass some form of major health reform legislation, especially during a coronavirus pandemic. And they would also have to pass, obviously, coronavirus-related relief legislation. And a lot of things would have been on the table in Congress, and I think that would have given us an urgent place to fight to advocate for Medicare for all. And at that point, we would have to deal with all this bullshit about, you know, a public option and, you know, this claim that you can somehow slowly get to universal health care without doing Medicare for all, without kicking out private insurance companies, which is wrong and totally inaccurate and hasn't been done anywhere in the world. But with a divided Congress, unfortunately, not much happens, right? Legislatively, there's going to be very little major legislation that can move through Congress at all. Sadly, I was reading that this is apparently Wall Street's favorite outcome because they didn't want Trump to be reelected, because Trump was starting to do pursue antitrust regulations on, like, you know, Facebook and Google and Amazon, you know, all the big companies he sees as like funding Democrats and being his enemy in his grand conspiracy theory of the world. So they didn't like Trump because of that. But then Wall Street was worried that Democrats would get elected and that they would pass, you know, higher corporate taxes, that they might pass healthcare reform, like all these other things, maybe even a public option, which obviously insurance companies also don't like the public option. So this is
knowing
Wall Street's
how little it would do.
Yeah.
I mean, not knowing how little it would do, sort of
yeah, and even
estimating the impact of a public option, especially the way the Democrats would pass it.
And, you know, it's potential, you know, we don't need to digress too much on the public option here because we're not going to get one. But you could conceive of a scenario where a lot of people move from private insurance into a public option, which isn't going to improve their lives that much. You're still going to be paying a premium. You're still going to have the same, you know, limitations that insurance companies have, but it would impact the bottom line of insurance companies, right? So they might be more afraid of it then it helps real people, which is kind of weird. Like you put up the whole fight with the healthcare industry and then you don't get anything for it. So yeah, Wall Street loved this outcome, but for everyone else, I think both in the right and the left, it's not ideal because very little happens. This is like the weird feature of American politics. I got to live in England for 1 year. If you've ever lived outside of the United States, which I know, Stephanie, you have as well, most countries have a parliamentary system, right? Where if a party or a coalition wins power in Congress or in Parliament, they also get to elect the prime minister, and they can kind of implement the agenda that they ran on. That doesn't happen here. You have to win all three pieces of the pie to get anything through. And then sometimes the Supreme Court will strike it down and you still haven't accomplished what you can. So the windows to pass major health reform, including Medicare for All, are very, very small, and they only happen every once in a while. And sadly, like, this is not going to be one of those moments, even though we thought it might be.
So what do we fight for?
Good question. So, I think, we had been kind of preparing for potentially, especially like around coronavirus relief, fighting for the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act, which was, the Sanders Jayapal bill that would have basically made everyone eligible for Medicare if you don't have health insurance already. But again, that is also, in a split Congress is really going to be difficult. So I think the message I would give to folks is that there's different types of organizing you want to do during like quiet times where major legislation is not on the table, as opposed to like the busy times when, healthcare is really in the news. It's on top of the headlines. We know something is potentially going to happen. It's just unclear what it's going to be. Those times are really different. That's where you see major uprisings of people, like marches in the street, massive civil disobedience. Those are those like takeoff moments. And it can happen from either the left side or the right side, so to speak. I think we saw a lot of that when Republicans tried to repeal and replace Affordable Care Act. But we also saw that when the Affordable Care Act was being debated itself, and when Democrats did have the House and the Senate and the presidency, and we knew health reform of some sort was going to pass through. But all the rest of the time, which is kind of what we've seen the last 4 years, it's a different type of organizing, right? You really want to do more of this base building and gradual expansion of the movement. And it's not like some people don't like this type of organizing, is my sense. Stephanie, I don't know if you've got the same sense from activists. Some people really only like the street actions and like the high visibility stuff. They don't like the quiet behind the scenes, like, I'm going to reach out to this group and give a presentation and see if they're willing to get involved.
I don't even know that it's not that they don't like it. I think they just don't know of it, because the way that we understand social movements is that it's something that happens when people come out and flood, Washington, or do some other sort of like high visibility action, and then somehow that puts pressure. There's not like a very direct analysis between like what's actually happening and how all the behind the scenes stuff that actually went into maybe that march, or something that happened around the march that was also pivotal in moving the power structure. And so I think that our job is also to teach people how to do the kind of organizing that they need to build more power as well. And that is something that Healthcare Now actually does. Just random plug for us and
check
for the
out
single payer
school on our website. Yeah, I agree 1,000%. I mean, it's understandable that people don't understand the other type of quiet time, like outreach and organizing and base building and power building work, because you don't see it on TV. If you haven't already been in a movement for a long time, you probably haven't experienced it in the same way that you've like seen these big dramatic actions on TV, whether that be the history of it or the present day sort of actions, like big Black Lives Matter actions. But in truth, most social movements that win do not win through those big actions. They do win through the more gradual base building expansion of the movement quietly behind the scenes. And, we never, ever would have seen the Bernie Sanders, like 2016 run, or the run we just saw in, the 2019 run, without all of that organizing and base building movement that our movement has done over the years, and also that of a bunch of allied movements.
Yeah.
Having nothing to do with healthcare.
I really like the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act as an organizing vehicle, by the way, just to come back to what we were talking about before, just because, it speaks to like an immediate need that people are having in this crisis. And of course, Medicare for All also speaks to an immediate need that we all have, but it's also much more easily implementable than full Medicare for all, yet still actually paving a way to Medicare for all, which unlike the public option does not do. The public option just creates like a whole new program that doesn't in any way interface with Medicare and doesn't really lead a path to Medicare for all, whereas the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act would be like putting us on a path, and it's also immediately actionable. So I think that it's a good way of bringing attention to the need for Medicare for all and also activating people around a piece of legislation that can actually pass.
Yeah, Fox News would probably call it like the gateway drug for Medicare for all.
Good.
And I think I might agree with them. Sometimes the drug after the gateway drug is better. So, and we did see like Senator Ron Wyden in Oregon did co-sponsor the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act, but has not yet co-sponsored the full Medicare for All bill. So the pandemic really is transforming, I think, people's understanding of the need for Medicare for All, but it is shocking how little press attention there has been so far to, how badly our healthcare system is failing us during the biggest healthcare crisis that we've ever experienced in our lives. So, yeah,
most of it is actually just fawning the ACA for picking up the slack, where people are losing their healthcare, and well, at least you have the option of purchasing an expensive full price plan on the ACA if that happens. So,
yeah, good thing we have all this employer sponsored healthcare. It's a great time for that now that everyone has lost their jobs. So I guess in closing, there's just one other thing I wanted to focus on, Stephanie. I've been starting to do a little bit of analysis of like the Democratic districts whose representatives have not yet got on board the Medicare for All bill, and starting to look a little bit how they're different than the existing districts where we do have legislators on the Medicare for All bill. And I haven't finished this analysis, so I won't go too much in depth, but if you'll humor me at the end of this podcast, I just wanted to give some like previews of what I found. So one of the shocking things I've found is that if you look at the current co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill in the House, more than 50% of those co-sponsors are people of color, either non-white or Latinx. And non-white and Latinx people are less than 20% of the House membership. And it's almost identical when you look at like the race and ethnicity of the districts that they're representing. It's pretty much the same. It's the districts that represent communities of color and representatives who are people of color are really propping up the Medicare for All bill disproportionately. And I'll go one further than that. And it's actually women of color are disproportionately propping up the Medicare for All bill as well. If you look at like Black female reps in the House, over 68% support the Medicare for All bill, and that's higher than Black male reps, about 57%. Same thing with Latinx reps. Female Latinx reps, 64% support the Medicare for All bill, whereas 52% of Latinx men. So when you think about it, it's almost kind of like the dynamics behind the whole Democratic Party, right? Across the country, right? It's like people of color are kind of holding up the Democratic Party, and especially women of color are holding up the Democratic Party, without which this whole party system would collapse, would have already collapsed. So that was the first thing that kind of stuck out at me.
And then the Democratic Party turns around and says, defund the police and all the progressive things that people of color have actually been advocating for, just throwing them right under the bus right after delivering a victory to the presidency. Totally.
And I was really struck by, that we talked about this caucus call where a couple of reps were like saying that they were losing because of progressives fighting for Medicare for all and defund the police and stuff. And Rashida Tlaib on the same caucus call said, basically you're telling us we shouldn't advocate for the things that people of color want and need, right?
Ouch.
Yeah.
Oh, that's going to hurt them.
Pretty straight up, right? Yeah. I appreciated that bluntness and totally 100% true. But the flip side of this coin, when you turn your attention away from the legislators who are already on board Medicare for All bill and their districts and look at the Democratic districts whose reps are not on board, the picture is really very different. So when we look at that, the Democratic districts who, again, reps are not on board the bill, about 2/3 of those reps are white and non-Hispanic, and only 1/3 are people of color. And it's even more stark when you look at their districts. About 3/4 of those districts are a majority non-Hispanic white people, and only 1/4 of those districts are majority people of color. So I guess to the basic summary here is that the districts that we have to organize and win to get a majority in the House are going to be whiter districts, and they're also going to be higher income districts on average, and they're also going to be higher, educational levels, more people who have gone through college. I haven't yet done any analysis on the Senate side, but I'm going to take a wild guess here because, as you know, the Senate is basically a racist institution. You get 2 reps per state. It doesn't matter what the population of the state is. And overwhelmingly, the small states who the Senate is representing disproportionately are very white. So there's really only a few people of color in the entire Senate. And there's not enough Democrats who are people of color or Latinx in the Senate to prop up Bernie's Medicare for All bill in the way that Pramila Jayapal's bill in the House is propped up. So that's why I think we see much lower support levels. And we saw a jump forward. We saw, 16 senators joined Bernie Sanders when he introduced the bill this past year. But that's a far cry from the percentage of the House Democrats who we have on board. We have almost 50% of House Democrats on board, and we have a long ways to go in the Senate. And I think partly it's because of these sort of race and income dynamics. So I haven't really, I think we need people who have really deep knowledge of these districts to know exactly what's going on. Because as you know, as well as I do, Stephanie, some of these districts that are represented by white people and that are higher income on average and white on average are hiding gerrymandered districts where there are, really large communities of color who tend to be lower income, who have worse access to healthcare. So it doesn't, I would not say from this analysis that we need to organize rich white people to bring this movement over. I think that's the wrong takeaway. But I think one takeaway is that the balance of power in these districts is different, right? And that we can't, as a movement, we have a white community problem, I think, in the country when it comes to healthcare and probably all other issues too, if we're being honest. Yeah. And we can't just rely on communities of color and legislators of color to get this over the finish line. We have to do way more organizing in the other communities as well. So,
yeah. And one of the things that we didn't mention in our wrap up of the Trump era was that while we did have a huge boost in co-sponsors sort of in 2017, right at the beginning, things sort of plateaued and we haven't been as successful in making inroads past the low-hanging fruit that we have already picked. And I think that these numbers sort of that you're showing us here, I mean, this is what's happening, right? We've got a lot of people of color. The districts who are represented by people of color are already on the bill, and we have this, kind of white people problem that we're going to have to deal with.
WPP, the opposite of OPP.
And it's, again, I wish I had something more relevant to say about how we organize those communities and what this even means for our movement, which has thought of itself as being very white. And that is actually rather true. And yet at the same time, we're having a disproportionate representation of people of color actually in the Medicare for All caucus. So
yeah, and to me, that one of the things that says to me is that there's a lot of organizing going around for Medicare for All that's happening that is not like coming from the Medicare for All movement, you know? Like a lot of these districts, clearly legislators feel that they have to run on Medicare for All to get support in their districts from people of color. So that means there is a form of organizing going on, even if it's not like a single issue Medicare for All group that lives there and, you know, is kind of the face of the movement in that district. So there's a lot of organizing happening at the grassroots level that is not seen in our movement, I think, that we don't think of as part of our movement. But yeah, we are going to have to get this over the finish line, because we took this huge leap forward in 2017. And I think we need to start thinking about what the next leap looks like. Like, how do we get that next, 60 to 70 legislators, just the way that we did 2 years ago? And it's going to require a lot of this organizing. But we do have to think about, in New York, how do you organize the Long Island districts? We have no Democratic representatives on board the Medicare for All bill in Connecticut or Iowa or New Hampshire. These are very kind of white states. And in some of those, it kind of makes sense. Like Connecticut is like the home of all these corporate headquarters of insurance companies, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in Iowa or New Hampshire. So we have to do better organizing in these places if we want to win eventually. So.
Yeah, and like you were saying, with those districts that are higher income, they are of course masking some communities of color or lower income communities within them. And so I think that creating a coalition, that the one that we always talk about,
yes.
multiracial working class coalition, where white working class people are also brought into the fold to be joined with the people of color who are already organizing. I think that is essentially going to be the task, because I don't think organizing rich people to give, fairly financed healthcare is really an option.
I will submit my resignation when that becomes Healthcare Now's mission. Somebody else can take on that task. So yeah, I think, like everyone else, we're just beginning to think about, what does our organizing priorities look like? How do we really move the ball and advance this movement over the next year or two, given the Congress and political landscape we got, as opposed to the one we were expecting? So we are just starting to think about this. We haven't had all of our strategic planning meetings yet, but we will, and I think we'll bring folks more thoughts on this as we have them. So congratulations, happy post-Trump era,
Yay.
Stephanie. We'll bring back another exciting, in fact, I think our next podcast is going to be about racial justice and the intersection of Medicare for All movement, right?
Yes.
How topical is that?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, bye, everyone. Bye, Stephanie.
Thanks for listening. Bye.